So I recently saw a TikTok of some mistakes that natives make that learners would think are totally stupid. And it got me thinking and wanting to talk a little bit about those mistakes from my perspective as a language learner and as an English teacher. Before I begin, I do have to define what a mistake is. In English-speaking countries, academic spheres don't usually have a prescriptivist look on language. They don't usually say how a nation should be using its language. Instead, most government institutions or dictionaries will just describe the language as it is used. I say this in contrast to some cultures like in France, where they have l'Académie Française that makes recommendations of what the language should be, and some mistakes get rejected this way. And they reject changes to the language that arise from some grammar mistakes. The descriptivist mindset wouldn't really call anything a mistake. If people speak that way, that is the true language, according to a more descriptivist view on language. However, I think most people are a little bit somewhere in the middle. Many Americans, for example, wouldn't say that the accent of a region is wrong per se. For example, if a Canadian says a boot, or if a New Yorker says coffee, most Americans would probably say, oh, that's just the way they speak where they're from. However, I think I've noticed that many Americans and Brits and other English-speaking countries are a bit prescriptivist when it comes to the writing of the language, which may explain why English pronunciation has changed so much over the years, but our writing has remained pretty consistent. One example that a prescriptivist will say is wrong, but I wouldn't say is wrong, is, for example, using a preposition at the end of the sentence. This is just what I was looking for. According to prescriptivists, that might be wrong to say because you can't end the sentence with for. In my eyes, however, the alternative is so awkward that it is not even English. So maybe a prescriptivist would approve of someone saying, this is the thing for which I was looking. There are some prescriptivist recommendations that I would agree with, and that's the topic of today's video. A lot of these mistakes come from approximations of how people pronounce certain words. These things I think are okay to reject in my mind. From my perspective as an English teacher, the English language would become so unintelligible and irregular if these changes were accepted. So it's good to reject them from my perspective. That's not to say that the people who make these mistakes are stupid. I don't think that at all. How can you blame someone for trying to write exactly how they speak? I just want to make a lighthearted video about some mistakes that natives will make and explain to a native why this sounds so ridiculous to a learner. It's maybe natural to think that a learner will make a lot of mistakes, but I kind of want to shake things up a bit and show that natives make a lot of mistakes too. The mistakes I'm talking about today show a really deep understanding of how everyday language is used, but a misunderstanding of the underlying English syntax and structure. Basically, I'm calling these examples today mistakes, but I wouldn't call regional differences mistakes. Without further ado, here are a few common English mistakes that a native will make that will baffle a learner. There, and there are a very good example. Confusing these is complete nonsense for a learner, I think. All three of these words aren't even connected in a lot of learners' minds, despite having the same pronunciation. So when a learner thinks of the opposite of here, they're going to say there. If they use possession, they're going to say there. If they contract they and are, they'll use there. Because learners think very structurally, these words aren't even in the same group in their mind. But because the pronunciation is similar, it's confusing for some natives. And because learners can also see a little bit of the etymology in their spelling, it's also pretty easy to reinforce when this should be used and when that should be used. There looks like here, and there looks like our or your. So because of this, for most learners who learn from books, this mistake is total nonsense for a native to make. Then I also have your and your, which is in a similar situation for phonetic reasons. Native speakers might confuse these, but because of their clearly different etymology, different usage, it would be very confusing for a learner if you use the wrong one. They wouldn't understand why you confuse them. They're so different. Then there is the mistake of using the wrong form of the past tense. So some native speakers might say, I should have went to the store earlier, when it really should have been, I should have gone. Maybe some learners will say, I've already drank 3 beers, when they should have said, I've already drunk 3 beers. For English learners, I think this kind of mistake is pretty rare, but it is possible for different reasons. Instead of confusing the past participle and the simple past, what's more likely is that a learner would use the infinitive instead. They might have said, I should have go to the store earlier. So really confusing simple past went with past participle gone or drank and drunk is really confusing for some learners. So I think that if a learner were to memorize all of the forms of verbs, go, went, gone, drink, drank, drunk, they would already know where to use these forms. So it's very unlikely they would confuse these, and they wouldn't understand why natives confuse them structurally. Have goes with some kind of past participle, and simple past is just by itself. It's just a verb. For native speakers of European languages especially, back translating this would be so nonsensical that I think it would be very hard to understand why natives make this mistake. But I think someone could make this mistake as a learner if they were just confusing the parts of the verb. They don't really confuse the structure, they more so confuse which one is which. But native speakers don't even know the structure and which one is structurally correct, even if they forget which one is which. Would've, should've, could've. To be honest, I usually don't correct people's grammar much, but these especially just like get under my skin. And that's especially because just syntactically it makes no sense and it's so painful to read, I think. I can confidently say that no learner has ever made this mistake in English. This mistake comes from reducing the pronunciation of have when speaking at a normal speed of English. But this would be complete nonsense if a learner saw this in an English speaking comment section, for example. If a learner wanted to use these modal verbs in the past tense, they would either not do it because their native language doesn't do this, so they don't understand the need to do it, and they don't know that this is even a possibility in English, or they will properly use have and a participle in this situation. But never, never, never would they use of instead of have, because that requires knowing that modals can be in the past, but for some reason connecting a participle with of, and it just the grammar just makes no sense, and it gets under my skin when I see it. Now I want to mention some mistakes that are a little bit different from the ones I already went over. I think that the following mistakes, I think some learners might make, but because they're so grammatically minded, if you explain it to them one time, they'll get it right every time from then on out. But if you explain this to a native, which one's correct, they're going to forget in 2 minutes and use it incorrectly again. And they will definitely get it incorrect again if they're a monolingual English speaker. Affect and effect, I think, is a really common pair of confusion, or if I wasn't emphasizing the pronunciation, affect and effect. So basically, in modern English, affect is the verb and effect is the noun. That's it, done. The learner will understand and use it correctly every time from here on out. The effect on the economy was so small, we will have to wait and see how this affects the economy. And then a learner will never make this mistake again. But I think a native English speaker will continue to make this mistake, and I think that's a little bit confusing for some learners to understand why this pair in particular causes so many problems for English natives. Its and its are a very problematic pair. One is a contraction of it is, and one is a possessive adjective pronoun alongside my, your, our, their. It is completely understandable, however, to make this mistake because usually apostrophe s denotes some kind of possession, but in this situation apostrophe s is only the contraction and pronouns just never use apostrophes. So this is just one of English's oddities and irregularities, and we just have to accept that. That oddity being a possessive with s doesn't have an apostrophe for once. But I think learners would be surprised with how often this mistake is made by native speakers. So good versus well, I think, is a very interesting pair. Because on the one hand, I am a little torn because the distinction between adjective and adverb isn't very strong. Flat adverbs exist in English. They've existed for hundreds of years, and that's totally acceptable and fine. But I think good and well are a little different in a way because those have very distinct forms and aren't interchangeable as many adjective and adverb forms are. For example, safe and safely. I will sometimes use safe as an adverb, sometimes use safely as an adverb, and safe only as the adjective. But good and well are a little special because good is only the adjective and well is only the adverb. So a native speaker might say, "You sing good," but this sounds like nails on a chalkboard to me because good is never an adverb, at least in my English. The reason that a lot of natives might make this mistake is because a lot of other forms of adverbs are losing their distinction. So it makes sense that good and well also will lose their distinction. But because I'm someone who rejects a lot of prescriptivist recommendations for English, I do accept that probably in 100 years or so, the distinction between adverbs and adjectives are probably going to disappear, and good and well might also lose their difference. So I think a lot of English learners might be surprised how commonly these are confused by natives, but I think what's more likely is that a learner will make a mistake with the comparative and superlative forms. So, for example, good, better, best, well, better, best, bad, worse, worst, badly, worse, worst. So it's really a matter of perspective of which mistake is more shocking. But this is why I put it in this section, because it's not too strong of a mistake, but it could be difficult for some learners to understand why native speakers do this. The last one I want to go over is one that I actually make a few mistakes on, me even as someone who is a native and teaches English. And that's lay, laid, laid, lie, lay, and lain. The two verbs that should be distinct. I don't normally make a mistake in the present tense, but for the past tense, I usually have to Google the forms of the verbs because I just forget them so often. I think to explain this to a learner, the explanation is very simple. Lay is a transitive verb and lie is an intransitive verb. So lay always needs an object, lie never needs an object. So in many languages, lay and lie have different translations, so they can actually literally translate into their language to remember which is which. But for native English speakers, especially monolinguals, it's hard to remember which one is which. And that makes total sense because in general, the distinction between transitive and intransitive is slowly dying away in English. So probably within a few generations, these two will merge together, or one of these is completely going to be obsolete. But for the time being, these are two distinct verbs. So those are a few common mistakes that natives will make that might confuse an English learner. Why would you do that? That's nonsense. That's not meant to disrespect anybody. Nobody is stupid. Everybody makes mistakes. And if they make the mistake enough, it becomes reality. So I do teach English lessons on italki, so if you're an English learner and like my style of teaching, my more descriptivist style, teaching how it is rather than how it should be, you can find me on italki for English lessons. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in another video soon. Bye-bye.